So I have a confession to make. I love a good Western. All those old Clint Eastwood spaghetti Westerns like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Hang 'em High, A Fistful of Dollars, and the newer Westerns too like Pale Rider, Unforgiven, Wyatt Earp, and Open Range. I love them all. Yeah, I know they're highly romanticized and sanitized versions of what that time and place was like, but they're good stories where usually the good guy wins. But one thing about those old Westerns, when it comes to nature stuff, well, they weren't always the most accurate. So today I want to talk about how some of the nature depicted in movies and TV shows set in the Old West tends to be, well, a bit misleading. Now, some of the things I'm going to talk about today I've touched on before in other episodes. But today, we're going to round them up and corral them all in one place. So saddle up and let's head west. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. To help me tell you how these Westerns misled us, I'm going to tell you the story of Black Bart. Well, he's known as Black Bart because, well, he always wears a black hat. I mean, how else would you know that he's the bad guy? Now, old Bart was one of the meanest, orneriest, most low-down, good-for-nothing, lying, cheating, dirty, rotten scoundrels ever to have lived in the Old West. A lily-livered, yellow-bellied, cowardly sort who would shoot a man just for looking at him sideways. Old Bart was also a thief, and one day after robbing a stagecoach down near Lubbock, Texas, he was on the run from old Johnny Law, headed for his secret hideout, a cave out in the desert down a Mexico way. But Bart had a problem. You see, as he was making his getaway in a hail of bullets, one of them hit his canteen, and now he found himself out in the broiling hot desert without a single drop of water. Bart was in desperate need of water. His lips were cracked from the hot desert sun, and the vultures were circling overhead, just waiting for him to collapse. He didn't even have to look up to see them. He knew they were there because he could hear their cries. Except that's not the cry of a vulture, it's the call of a red-tailed hawk. And that's not how vultures forage. First of all, vultures don't have a syrinx, the vocal organ of birds, so the only sound they make are grunts or low hisses. It kind of sounds like this. And even then, it's not a sound they really make in flight. It's mostly used when they're arguing over food. But the folks that made those old Westerns didn't care much for the actual sounds that vultures make. The cry of the red-tailed hawk is much more dramatic. And speaking of food, vultures are obligate scavengers. They feed almost exclusively on carrion. You know, stuff that's already dead. On very, very rare occasions, vultures might kill a sick or injured animal, but they don't generally attack healthy animals. And they certainly don't circle hungrily overhead waiting for death to occur. They just show up after it already has. We even call people vultures if they're waiting for a tragedy to occur so they can benefit. But I think that's unfair to actual vultures. Often people in movies or TV find the dead bodies, whether human or otherwise, by observing where vultures are kettling, which, by the way, is what a group of circling vultures is called, a kettle. But that's just silly. If there was something dead there, the vultures would be on the ground feeding on it, not circling around overhead. And I can tell you from experience that those kettles don't usually stay in one place for very long. I've been participating in a community science project to document turkey vultures here in Wyoming, and frequently when I see a kettle, I look down at my phone to document it, and by the time I look back up a minute or so later, it's moved far enough that it's barely visible, if it's still visible at all. Kettling is just one of the ways that vultures forage, riding the thermals to get a better view and a better sniff, because vultures actually forage primarily by smell. Now, a lot of birds don't have a very good sense of smell, but vultures have the largest olfactory system of any bird. They can smell the beginnings of decay from over a mile away. Now, to be sure, Bart didn't exactly smell like a spring daisy. It's possible that those vultures were drawn to him by the potent combination of body odor, poor dental hygiene, and a festering sore or two, but it's unlikely. And don't go insulting them by comparing them to Bart. Unlike Bart, vultures are actually very beneficial. Thanks to their exceptionally corrosive stomach acid, they can digest carrion infected with bacteria that could be lethal to other scavengers and dangerous to humans, like cholera, botulism, and anthrax, which of course removes those pathogens from the environment. Well, no matter, because just as Bart was about to collapse from dehydration, he spotted his salvation, a large cactus. Summoning his last bit of energy, he ran to the spiny monolith and dropped to his knees. Pulling out his knife, Bart sliced a hole in the cactus, mouth already watering at the thought of the cool, clear liquid contained inside. Except that's not really how cactuses work. Cacti, again unlike Bart, are well adapted to life in the desert. Water is the most precious resource for everything in the desert, and cacti wouldn't have survived long without being both really good at conserving it and having a really good multi-tiered security system to protect it. Almost all cacti are succulents, which means they have thickened fleshy parts adapted for storing water. In most cacti, this fleshy part is the stem. And most species of cacti have lost true leaves, retaining only spines, which actually are, in fact, highly modified leaves. Now, in addition to deterring animals from eating them and being painful when you accidentally fall off your mountain bike and land on them, these spines help prevent water loss by reducing airflow close to the stem and, believe it or not, providing some shade. In the absence of leaves, and in addition to storing water, the cacti's enlarged stem actually carries out the process of photosynthesis. But cacti are not thorn-covered reservoirs of fresh water. What's inside a cactus is a noxious jelly-like fluid that's generally toxic to humans. In addition to their spines, most cacti protect their spongy flesh with acids and potent alkaloids, which can cause kidney problems in humans, especially when those kidneys are already weakened by dehydration. Eating the flesh of some cactus species can cause vomiting and diarrhea, further exacerbating any dehydration, or even cause temporary paralysis, none of which are very conducive to survival in the desert. There's two species of cactus that are edible, the prickly pear and the fishhook barrel cactus, but both are said to be fairly unpleasant when eaten raw. But those two do have lower concentrations of harmful chemicals and could provide a little bit of hydration in a pinch. The fruits of cacti are even better, but most of those are also unpalatable if eaten raw. When researching the edibility of cacti, I read this quote: "Plant experts say that the fishhook barrel cactus is the least problematic of the extensive cacti family when used as a water source in the desert," unquote. Least problematic is not exactly a glowing endorsement. They go on to say that it should only be used in an extreme emergency, only in small amounts, and never on an empty stomach. Had Bart's luck run out? Well, not yet. It turns out that his hideout was just a few miles south of the Rio Grande, and as luck would have it, he could see the river from where he knelt by the cactus. So, stumbling to the riverbank instead, he drank his fill, rinsed the salt from his sunburned face, and continued on to his secret hideout in the hills. Bart reached his hideout around sunset, and as darkness started to gather, Bart too started to gather firewood. Reaching down to pick up some dead mesquite branches, he felt something odd, something hairy, something alive. He realized, a second too late, that he had just grabbed a desert tarantula. He felt a sharp stinging in his hand and flung the spider off, watching in horror as the beast lumbered off into the darkness. Bart sat down heavily, staring at his wounded hand. This is it, he thought. After everything I've survived, I'm going to be brought down by a dadgum spider. He waited for the spider's venom to work its way to his heart and stop it once and for all. Except that's not how tarantulas work. A lot of times in movies, tarantulas are huge, easily as big as your hand or bigger, and their bites are something to be feared. A victim usually only has a matter of moments before they clutch their chest and keel over dead. But the truth is that while bites can be painful, barring a severe allergic reaction, no tarantula in the world is considered to be medically significant. Getting bit by a tarantula, which I might add are reluctant to bite, is said to be like getting stung by a bee or a wasp. And as for size, well, the largest species of tarantula in the world is the Goliath bird-eating tarantula. It can have a body that measures 5 inches, 13 centimeters, and a leg span of 12 inches, 30 centimeters. Now, no doubt that is a massive spider, but guess what? They don't live in North America. Bart would have had to run all the way to South America just to encounter one of those. The largest tarantula in North America is the Texas brown tarantula, whose leg span is just 4 inches or 10 centimeters. Now, it's still a big spider, sure, but not nearly as big as what the movies usually portray. Well, eventually, when he didn't die, Bart realized that the spider bite wasn't going to kill him after all, unless he could die of irritation. The sting of the bite had dropped to a dull throb, but hairs from the spider, called urticating hairs, although Bart didn't know that, had gotten embedded in his skin and were causing the area to itch like the dickens. It reminded him of that time he accidentally ran through a patch of stinging nettles in his skivvies. Bart also didn't know that many tarantulas can actually eject these hairs at a threat. Animals that get these hairs stuck in sensitive areas like eyes or their nose probably experience a great deal more discomfort than what Bart was dealing with. Well, with a fire built and the sting in his hand fading, Bart took off his boots, laid down on his bedroll, and drifted off to sleep. The next morning he woke early. Pulling on his boot, he felt a pain in his foot like nothing he had ever felt before. It made the tarantula bite from the day before feel like a tickle in comparison. Had Bart known what electricity was, he might have said it felt like getting shocked. Pulling the boot off and turning it over, he saw the source of his new agony. An Arizona bark scorpion had crawled into his boot during the night and stung him on the foot when he pulled it on. "Great googly moogly," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Now I'm a goner for sure." Except that's not how scorpions work either. To be sure, Bart was in for a rough couple of days. The Arizona bark scorpion is the most venomous scorpion in North America. In humans, its venom can cause severe pain coupled with numbness, tingling, and vomiting that lasts for anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. The stung area might be paralyzed briefly, or it might even convulse. But the sting of the bark scorpion is rarely fatal. In fact, while thousands of people are stung by these arachnids each year in Arizona, which, despite the scorpion's name, is only a small part of its range, since 1968, there have only been 2 known deaths in the state as a result. A couple of other interesting things about these scorpions: they glow under UV light. Of course, Bart, being in the Old West, didn't have a UV light because they hadn't been invented yet. And the grasshopper mouse is immune to the venom of the Arizona bark scorpion. In fact, scientists have found that the scorpion venom acts as an analgesic rather than a pain stimulant in these small rodents. Now, Bart may have found that last bit interesting, amusing even, that he, a full-grown, hard-bitten man, could be laid so low by that scorpion, while a small little mouse would be not only ineffective, but could actually be cured of a headache by the scorpion's sting. If that don't beat all. Although Bart was in so much pain that, had a nature nerd shared that little tidbit with him, he may have found himself looking down the wrong end of a 6-shooter, if you know what I mean. When the pain and vomiting subsided a few days later, Bart decided that maybe he should head into town and stock up on supplies. He had plenty of money from his recent heist, but he was low on beans and coffee, and you may recall he needed a new canteen. Heck, he might even treat himself to a nice hotel room where he didn't have to worry about spiders and scorpions. So he saddled up his horse and headed into town. As old Bart rode up the dirt street of the town, he noticed it seemed oddly quiet. The few people he saw quickly ducked inside, and the click of the door locking behind them seemed extra loud in the silence. Then Bart noticed the wanted dead or alive poster bearing his name tacked up outside the saloon. "It seems," Bart drawled, "that my reputation has preceded me." Dismounting his horse, he tied it up to the hitching post in front of the general store. And no sooner had he finished than he heard a voice. "Bart, you're under arrest." He turned to see the town sheriff standing alone in the middle of the dirt street. Bart smiled. "That's so, Sheriff? Well, I reckon we'll see about that now, won't we?" His spurs rang as he moved to the street and faced the sheriff, hand hovering over the butt of his gun in his holster. A tumbleweed blew across the deserted street between the two men. Except, did it? Probably not. Let's talk about tumbleweeds. Like, what exactly are tumbleweeds? Well, tumbleweeds are the above-ground parts of certain plants that, when they get mature and dry, they break off from the root. Most tumbleweeds are about the size and shape of a basketball and very lightweight, so the wind causes them to roll, dispersing their seeds. And let me assure you that out here in the West, we have plenty of wind. But the period that's generally considered to be the Old West was from roughly 1865, so the end of the Civil War, to around 1895. The plants that form tumbleweeds are not native species. It's a plant called Russian thistle. Guess where it's from? If you said Russia, well, you're right. And they first arrived in North America somewhere around 1880, so already halfway through the Old West era. It's believed they arrived in shipments of flaxseed imported from Russia. But the thing about Russian thistle is that it's fantastic at exploiting loose or disturbed soil where there isn't much other vegetation, which pretty much describes the high plains and desert Southwest landscapes. Russian thistle, both the plant and the tumbleweed, became fairly widespread by, about 1890. But by then, the era known as the Old West, the era portrayed in all these movies and TV shows, was pretty much over. Nowadays, tumbleweeds are all over the place, and they can be quite problematic. First of all, they burn like nobody's business, and they're capable of spreading wildland fires significant distance, both by their normal rolling motion and by getting caught in updrafts and flying over fire breaks. Their prickly branches tend to stick together, and they can pile up. In 2018, strong winds blew tumbleweeds into a northeast Los Angeles neighborhood. The piles reached 2 stories tall and blocked the entrances to about 100 homes. It took 2 days to clear them out. Likewise, in 2019, 5 cars and an 18-wheeler got trapped in a pile of tumbleweeds 15 feet tall, 4.6 meters. It took crews 10 hours to reopen the highway. But while they're common today and often a kind of icon of the Old West, the reality is that tumbleweeds were far rarer back then than movies and TV writers would have you believe. A bead of sweat ran down Bart's head. His eyes locked on the sheriff's, alert for the slightest sign that the lawman was reaching for his gun. But then he felt something in his feet, a vibration. A second later he heard it. Stampede! Their gunfight suddenly forgotten, the 2 men turned to see 100 head of cattle thundering down the dusty street, a brown haze of dust trailing behind them. Bart, concerned that the events of the last few days may have dulled his reflexes somewhat, what with spider bites and scorpion stings, decided that he might be better off avoiding a fight right now. So using the stampeding cattle for cover, he jumped on his horse and hightailed it out of there. Once outside of town, Bart stopped near a rocky outcrop, a high spot where he could get a good look to see if he was being pursued. To his relief, it looked like he was in the clear. But when he turned to go back to his horse, he heard a sound that chilled his blood. Rattlesnake. A western diamondback, to be specific. A big un, too, pert near 5 feet long. There it was, coiled, ready to strike, directly in his path. He was reaching for his gun, thinking about his mother's recipe for rattlesnake stew when it struck, sinking its fangs into his leg just above his boot before quickly disappearing into the rocks. Bart wouldn't have thought it possible that something could hurt more than the scorpion sting, but this was definitely worse. But there was no time to feel sorry for himself. Working quickly, Bart sat down, pulled up his pant leg, and pulled out his knife. The 2 puncture wounds on his leg were just starting to bleed. Using his knife, he cut a small X in each one. Then, raising his leg to his mouth, old Bart was remarkably flexible for an old cowboy, he started to suck the blood and spit it out. Suck the blood and spit it out, hoping to draw the venom out before it could reach his heart. Except, that's not how rattlesnake venom works either. But for certain, Bart was in a great deal more mortal peril than he had been up to this point. Rattlesnake venom makes tarantula and scorpion venom look like child's play. First of all, you should know that the whole suck the venom out thing, that doesn't work. Don't do that. If you get bit by a medically significant venomous snake, or even if you get bit by a snake you can't identify, you should call 911 immediately. But again, rattlesnake venom won't kill a human instantly. Small prey maybe, pretty close, but a person has some time to get emergency treatment with antivenom and painkillers and anti-inflammatory drugs and doctors who know how to take care of those sorts of things. Of course, Bart, back in the Old West, didn't have access to things like antivenom. The first experimental antivenom wasn't invented until 1890 and wouldn't be commercially produced until the late 1920s. Rattlesnake venom is a hemotoxin. It mainly affects the blood vessels, blood cells, and the heart. But it also contains compounds that destroy cells and muscles, adding to the damage sustained by the cardiovascular system. General effects at the site of the bite can include pain, heavy internal bleeding, severe swelling and muscle damage, bruising, blistering, and tissue death. Systemic effects can include headache, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, dizziness, and convulsions. Left untreated, 10 to 20% of rattlesnake bites are fatal. And even if he survived without access to modern medicine, let's face it, old Bart was never going to be the same. Bart did not, in fact, seek treatment, and he died within a few days. Several months later, Bart was found by some cattle ranchers, ironically the same ones whose cattle had stampeded through town. They only knew it was him, though, by the black hat still on his head. Well, what was left of it anyways. Now, I know that at the beginning I said that Bart was good for nothing, but I guess I was wrong. It turns out he was good for something after all. Just ask the vultures. And on that note, partners, we end the story of Black Bart. Thanks for listening to my tale. If you want to support the podcast, well, I think that would be just dandy. There's a few ways you can do that. I reckon the best way is to become a patron. Head on over to patreon.com/dispatchesfromtheforest for all the details. You can also make a one-time donation if you're so inclined, using the Cash App and the hashtag ForestNerd, or using PayPal and my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com. You can also use that email if you'd like to correspond with me. I mean, it's much more reliable than sending a telegram. Lastly, you can go get some Dispatches from the Forest merch down yonder at the Mercantile. That can be found at cafepress.com/shop/Dispatches from the Forest. And then if you click on products, you'll be privy to all the fun stuff we have to offer.
Keep smiling.
You can follow Dispatches from the Forest on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to get outside and get yourself dirty.
Till we meet again.
Okay, listen up, y'all. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest, so don't go using it or rebroadcasting it without express written permission, okay? Otherwise, I'll have to round up a posse and hunt you down. Alrighty then. So long.